Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about one of the most buzzworthy films of the year, Civil War. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So it is no secret to anyone that America today is a very divided, a very polarized nation, and that tensions seem unlikely to ease up anytime soon as we are in an election year. And kind of because of that kind of cultural, real-world backdrop, when the initial trailers for this movie dropped on the internet, they kind of blew up. A lot of discussion, kind of went viral. And director Alex Garland has always been kind of a provocative filmmaker with sort of his previous films. And with this film, he does explore a very kind of dystopian nightmare, kind of imagining a very worst case scenario for the country if we continue on the path that we're on. And I'll say that this is kind of an interesting film. It's a unique type of film that I kind of struggled even after I've seen the movie to simplistic labels of is it good, is it bad, should Christians watch it, should Christians not watch it. There's so many different elements going on with this movie that I think will be up to just individuals to decide how they kind of where they land on that. But one of the things that this film is, at least to me, is interesting. It's a film that does have a lot to say, a lot to kind of think through, and it is a very somber, at times difficult film to watch, kind of an unrelenting cautionary tale that definitely doesn't pull any punches. So given the film's subject matter, as well as some like the early marketing material for this film, it did suggest the possibility, at least, of this film being kind of a action-heavy, spectacle type blockbuster. But Civil War really is primarily like a character-driven story. Even like sort of the wider national scope of the Civil War conflict kind of remains relatively ambiguous, throughout the movie. And kind of instead of focusing on just sort of the wider stakes, it does center in more on kind of the experiences of a group of journalists as they are traveling kind of across the country to ultimately arrive at Washington, D.C. And kind of along the way of their journey, they're given, and vicariously the audience, is given sort of snapshots of kind of how different Americans, different locations in the country have been negatively impacted and changed by the ongoing conflict. And as you might expect from a film released through A24, all the actors, actresses in this are doing a good job, kind of central amongst the protagonists, these journalists that are traveling across the country. You have Lee Smith, who is the character played by Kristen Dunst, who is kind of a more older, kind of war journalist that's just hardened. She's weary, she's tired, just from a lifetime surrounded by conflict and war. And she is kind of contrasted with a character named Jesse, who is kind of a young, more aspiring photojournalist who just doesn't quite have like the age, the experience to grasp like the true gravity of the situation. And her character arc becomes probably the most interesting in this film, as it is sort of one of this, tragically lost innocence, where she goes from being naive to being sort of shocked and disturbed to ultimately becoming more jaded, kind of a victim of this divided world that is really the only thing she's ever known. And I'll say this too, I think Civil War is definitely a well-made movie, but it's not necessarily an entertaining one. I think it is immersive, and there is a lot of intriguing world building, and it is oftentimes gripping, like some of the action sequences with just kind of bullets flying and a lot of really impressive sound design that immerses you right into the center of this conflict. That can be captivating. There can be some excitement to that, but I'm not sure that this film was ever intended or designed to be a movie that you enjoy. Instead, it's presented almost with like an unwaveringly serious tone, kind of a very much like a cautionary tale, almost the equivalent of like a political version of like a fire and brimstone sermon, a la Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But of course, as a very polarized nation, kind of when a film is released that centers in on that division, on that infighting, kind of the inevitable first question that I think a lot of people want to ask is kind of which factions, which people get painted as the heroes in the story, which kind of, ones get framed as the villains. Kind of what is the point of view of this film? And perhaps surprisingly, the answer to that question is kind of neither. I think despite being obviously a very politically charged story, Civil War has a very relatively apolitical perspective. you do get very clear echoes of like real world sentiments, and I do think viewers can kind of read between the lines a bit and try and make guesses at what Alex Garland's sort of own political bent is. But for the most part, this film seems less interested in kind of pointing like accusatory fingers at any specific group of people, and instead presenting itself more as like a sweeping gesture, sort of, to America as a whole, which kind of seems to say, like, who cares whose fault it is or what, the specifics that led to this situation. Just sort of open your eyes to, to the consequences of that, which is very horrific. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, like I said at the start, this is a film that doesn't pull any punches, and that is true with the content that is displayed. As far as language, there is heavy profanity, really all throughout, featuring frequent F-bombs. I didn't have a count, but I would guess 30, 40, 50. They're coming all over the place, and as well as, a lot of other kind of minor profanities, and even I think God and Jesus' name get used kind of several times throughout as well. Sexuality, there isn't anything here. Kind of the only thing that comes close is Kristen Dunst's character in one scene briefly is like taking a bath, but it's not depicted in any kind of sexual way, and really all that's visible is just sort of her exposed knee. But violence, same can't be said, because there is a lot of violence, as you might expect from the subject of this film. In this movie, there's a lot of characters get shot. You see blood, you see sometimes, profuse blood pumping out of some of these wounded characters. Several people get lit on fire, and kind of that is documented. There's corpses and, dead bodies shown, including, like a very, like a mass grave filled with sort of these dead bodies. And just other kind of gruesome visuals of, like, the injuries from war and like skin flayed and blood. So there definitely is fairly heavy violence throughout this movie. Maybe the only other kind of content thing is that there is like drug use and alcohol use kind of scattered all throughout this as well. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, this isn't a film that requires a whole lot of like shrewd deductions to really parse out its intended messages and themes. Kind of rather than any kind of subtle allusions to, provoke thought, this film is more one that just sort of grabs audiences by the shoulders and like violently shakes them, just sort of bombarding them with shocking visuals and disturbing moments. Obviously, this movie is fiction, but it does seem like it's clearly intended to be linked to, what we know from reality, because during the opening moments of this film, there are several kind of short video clips, which I'm not 100% sure, but I believe are like scenes from real life, riots and protests and kind of acts of violence. And kind of by including those visuals at the start of the film, it does sort of establish this story as one that kind of suggests that the America that we know today is already on this slippery slope, kind of tumbling down the hill. And kind of the film that proceeds from those moments is sort of imagining what might await us, at the bottom of that hill. And if this film is to be taken as like a form of social commentary, then its focus is not necessarily on, critiquing, deconstructing any specific political ideology, and instead is more of a broad warning just on like the dangers of dehumanization and desensitization. And as mentioned earlier, Jessie, kind of the young aspiring photojournalist, is the clearest example of that, as she functions almost as like a representative of just sort of the younger generations and kind of probing the question of what are we leaving on to those that are coming behind us. But then there's other scenes, like there's one kind of where Garland will juxtapose different emotions, like where you have a public execution taking place with these hooded soldiers by a firing squad, kind of cutting back and forth with some of the victorious soldiers and journalists that are kind of excitedly, reliving the action and the excitement. And even the way that music is used throughout this, where there's sort of these almost uplifting, like, folky songs and kind of more positive music, which is kind of played over top of, acts of horrible violence, which just sort of goes to show how desensitized these characters have become to, the sights and sounds around them. And one of the aspects that I think frames this movie as, very much just a tragic film is that while there are kind of brief allusions now and then to sort of the events in the film that led to, the catalyst for sparked these, the war and the conflict, for most of the film, at least as the audience, it's not always clear why these factions are fighting and shooting and trying to kill each other, only that they are. And obviously, political policy can and should be debated, but it seems like the main message of Civil War is just to expose how empty and tragic and destructive that those disagreements become when we do lose sight of just the humanity in the other, in the other person. And as we know, Scripture in Genesis 1:27 teaches that all people, even the people we disagree with, are made in the image of God. And this movie sort of shows when we lose sight of that, fundamental truth. So in the end, is, America today on the brink of another civil war? Surely not, despite what some of the clickbait articles and headlines may want people to believe. But I do think that this film is effective in that by exaggerating, this exaggerated vision of, America's future, it is able to just expose the rottenness and of some of the sentiments that have crept in, to our culture today and led to the division, and the polarization. And at various times throughout this film, there is like a radio voiceover of, like the president, government figures, addressing the nation and alluding to being one nation under God. And yet the America portrayed in Civil War is a nation that appears to have wholly walked away from, some of those religious foundations and truth, leaving just division and hatred and just a lot of senseless death. I think this movie is obviously a fantasy, but like all good fantasy, I think there always are nuggets of truth for those that are willing to look. But hey, I would love to hear what you think of this film. Obviously, this is a movie that's going to, strike people different ways. I'm sure it's going to provoke a lot of, different opinions. But again, be respectful. Jump in the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. And if you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. I got lots of other, movie reviews and a podcast and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through a world for Christ.